Today we'll be talking with Joshua. He's the author of Blockchain Radicals, How Capitalism Ruined Crypto and How to Fix It. So yeah, really, appreciate you having on. And yeah, if you want to go ahead and take the stage and kick things off.
Yeah, sure. Thanks again for having me. Um, so in case you guys don't know me, I have a blog and a podcast called Blockchain Socialist that I've been running for a bit over 3 years now. And kind of what I've been doing is kind of on the nose, but I've kind of exploring this intersection of crypto and left-wing politics. And so I can just share, right? Okay.
Let me
I will
stop
just start sharing
this.
then. I have a Canva presentation. That would be probably nicer to show. But yeah, I wrote a book called Blockchain Radicals, How Capitalism Ruined Crypto and How to Fix It. It came out August 8th, so only been out for about a month and a half or so. And it's out through Repeater Books in the UK, if you know them. But yeah, I've been running this podcast called The Blockchain Socialist. I explore the intersection of crypto and left-wing politics. I've been working in the blockchain space for about 5 or so years. I've also co-founded a project called Bread Chain Cooperative, which is kind of like my attempt at trying to put a lot of the things that I talk about in the podcast into practice. So I try to kind of be more than just kind of like a talking head or like a media personality or something like that. I'm also interested in kind of building things, since that's kind of like the place where I came from, was building applications and such. And then I'm also filming a documentary on crypto called Crypto Futures, which Daniel has been interviewed a couple of times for. And then in case you're interested, kind of more recently on the podcast, I've been exploring the idea of, or exploring the book, The Network State, and kind of some of our criticisms. I've been doing this with Blockchain Gov, including Primavera de Filippi, if you know her, and kind of presenting an alternative conceptual framework for some of the ideas in the book. But so that's a bit about me. The picture on the right is just my avatar that I usually use. What I wanted to do for this talk is just kind of talk about the high level framework that I use for approaching the book. I was kind of approached by Repeater Books. They kind of just asked me, hey, we would love a book about blockchain from a left-wing perspective. Can you write something? And they kind of gave me like full creative freedom to write about whatever I wanted. So at first it was like really cool that I got that opportunity, of course. But it was at first kind of like daunting of like, how in the world am I supposed to structure this? And so I wanted to kind of talk about kind of how I went about my framework. And so I was very heavily influenced by a thinker called Gilles Deleuze. He's a philosopher, post-Marxist philosopher from France, from like the 60s to like the early 90s, I think is when he died. But he wrote a book called Difference and Repetition, in which he kind of goes over what he calls his critique of representational thinking. So he's kind of like writing a book, a philosophical book about philosophy and how to think. And so in it, he kind of talks about how generally people tend to take models of things that already exist, old things, and impose it onto the new as a way to kind of understand it. And so he argues that this is like a very limiting way of trying to understand something new, because it makes you think that the new thing is kind of just like the old thing. It limits kind of the way that we think about it. And kind of the way, or the example that I like to use to kind of explain his critique is through the drum machine. So the drum machine was a piece of technology that was created back in the day as a way to play music with your friends, in the potential possibility that, you know, your drummer wasn't able to come to band practice, right? So you would buy this piece of technology, you would set up the rhythm that you wanted to play, and you would press play, and then you get to strum your guitar along with it. Within this like conceptual model of what is the drum machine, we're kind of thinking of the drum machine as a representation of a drummer with a drum set, right? It's kind of like ideally you would want to have a drummer with a drum set, but you don't. So you buy the drum machine. And so the drum machine is a representation. It's also a less good version than having a drummer with a drum set. Ideally, you want your drummer with his drum set to be there so you can play music, but you don't, so you buy the machine. And so this is kind of like the way that people were thinking about it in the beginning. But then as time went on, people took the drum machine actually quite quickly, and they began to play beats and rhythms that no drummer could ever play on his drum sets, right? It's just like humanly impossible. They turned the dial up to 11, and now these beats are going so fast, no human could possibly play it, and thus creating new genres of music, new types of sound, even augmenting already existing genres of music. And so the drum machine, in one way, you can think of it as kind of breaking out of its representational model that was imposed on it. Or alternatively, you can think that the representational model of the drum sets as a representation of a drummer with the drum machine as a representation of a drummer with the drum set was always incorrect, that it was never the right way to think about the drum machine. The drum machine was its own thing that shouldn't necessarily be in this hierarchy against the drummer with the drum set. And so he describes this way of thinking as arboreal thinking, or thinking like a tree, in which you have the ideal form, which is like the Platonic ideal. This is our drummer with the drum set. This is what you ideally want to have. And then the branches being kind of the representations of it, the less good versions. This is super common frame of thinking in kind of like Western philosophy. So like it's a very, it kind of stems from Plato, and like he had this whole idea of like the ideal forms and such. And so Deleuze was kind of rejecting this entire framework for how to think about things generally. And kind of what he proposed, he was a very big fan of potatoes. He was like really interested in them, and that's because the roots of potatoes were rhizomatic, or they didn't have a clear center to them. That they were there was no clear hierarchy of which potato was like the best potato in them. They just had roots that kind of like all jumbled up together and had, you know, no clear center to them. And so he kind of argues that we should be thinking rhizomatically rather than arborescently. And so for the book, I take this framework of this critique of representational thinking, and I kind of realize that representational thinking is endemic in crypto, that it's all over the place. Sort of since the beginning, we're kind of constantly using representational models to kind of understand what this new thing of crypto is, in order to explain it to others, but also to explain it to ourselves. And so this starts, I mean, from the beginning, Bitcoin was thought of as a peer-to-peer cash system. And then that narrative changed to be more like that Bitcoin is a type of digital gold. So it kind of used this already existing kind of idea around money, ideally being something that is backed by gold as being an ideal form of money. And that was sort of imposed on to Bitcoin as something that it ought to be. Additionally, you see this in DeFi, decentralized finance, kind of like the creation of financial products, but on a decentralized medium. We have it in code is law, sort of equating code and law, smart contracts, even though it has nothing to do with a legal system. I would argue this is the same. Representational thinking is everywhere in the network states. If you, I mean, just the book, the title itself is very representational. Before they were called DAOs, they were called DACs, or decentralized autonomous corporations. So we see that like oftentimes people use representational thinking coming from a very particular ideological mindset. This one being a very kind of libertarian one. Like the idea for a lot of people in the beginning of crypto world was that we can use smart contracts to make the ultimate corporation in which no single person owns it, and everything is sort of automated, and hopefully I'll be the one who owns that corporation. I'll make a lot of money. Of course, Vitalik made the really good suggestion, I think, of substituting corporation with organization, kind of implying that there's more that you can make with smart contracts than just a corporation. You're just a for-profit entity. And I think like at this point, most people would agree that that was like a good decision to make, or a good suggestion. And so representational thinking is something that I would say is very common, especially from marketing, especially crypto marketers. When you're a marketer for something, you want to kind of, especially something that's kind of complicated like crypto, you kind of want to explain it as fast as possible, and you want to achieve your goals, right? You want to separate people from their money, right? Like that is the ultimate goal of marketing, is you want to sell it in a way that other people are willing to give their money, and they'll buy your tokens, they'll buy your product or whatever else. And so kind of what this is showing, I think what's happened in crypto, and especially in the beginning, was that they were intentionally marketing towards a very particular ideal kind of consumer in their head, which was a kind of like gold bug libertarian who was willing to spend money in order to reaffirm their ideological presuppositions about what they thought about the world and how ideally it ought to exist. And so this is, I would say, problematic, because this type of representational thinking doesn't actually explain to people kind of like what it does or what it actually is for. It kind of restricts the way that people think about crypto, and therefore restricts the way that people build on these systems too, because they're thinking about it in this ideological frame. And so the kind of aphorism, or the couple of aphorisms that I really like that I used that also inspired kind of like the framework of the book, was this one from Alfred Korzybski, in which he says, "The map is not the territory. The world is not the thing it describes. Whenever the map is confused with the territory, a semantic disturbance is set up in the organism. The disturbance continues until the limitation of the map is recognized." So what Korzybski is saying is that, you know, to take an example, you know, the map of Peru is different than actually existing Peru, right? We create maps of a territory, but that map never kind of completely is able to express everything about that territory. We're always abstracting something away in order to create a map, in order to have a better understanding of a territory. But what we abstract away is something that is often a political decision, or it's some sort of decision in order to say that like these things you don't need to worry about because that's going to overcomplicate it. This is the way that I'm going to explain it to you because this is the way I want you to understand it. And so what I'm trying to do with the book is kind of like point out that the map that people currently use in order to understand crypto is not properly understanding the territory. And so I'm kind of saying that there is this disturbance and that we need to kind of recognize the limitations of the current map in which we're trying to understand crypto. The other aphorism that I really like is this one from George Box, in which he says, "All models are wrong, but some are useful." So by that, I'm trying to say that metaphor isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? It's not that we can never use metaphor. Metaphors can be good and nice in order to help people begin to take the steps to kind of understand the thing that you're wanting to explain to them. But we have to be kind of careful about which models or maps we're trying to propose to people, because some are more useful than others, depending on what exactly it is they want it to be used for, right? And so with all of this, I think this is very closely related to the work of Antonio Gramsci, who wrote a lot about cultural hegemony. He was a communist who was killed by the Mussolini regime during World War II. And he kind of used this cultural hegemony as an idea to think about how the elite classes tend to impose on the lower classes or the working classes on what should be considered common sense. Like he's all about that, like there are things that people think as common sense. And oftentimes what is considered common sense is something that is imposed from the top, that there is a very high desire for those at the top to want you to think that common sense is going to be the things that just so happen to be what benefits the ruling classes. That they want you to think that it is common sense that you need to work for the company, you need to do this and that in order to have like a good life. And I think this is kind of an extension of kind of what has happened in crypto, is that a lot of times people think it's just common sense. We need to make a startup. We need to make a tech startup, and that's going to be the way that we are going to change the world. And we're going to do it with tokens. And there's this kind of like, I think this is like very heavily influenced by the influence of venture capital. And so in the book, I kind of go through the three most common in like chronological order of representational models that people kind of think about crypto through. So the first one is crypto as money, the second is crypto as finance, and the third is crypto as coordination. So this is kind of like chronologically the way that I've kind of seen and experienced how the crypto world and its narratives have evolved. It started off as like a thing about money, right? Bitcoin was peer-to-peer cash. Then it became about finance, and like the advent of smart contracts really pushed that. And then it really became focused on, like more recently, I think, in a certain niche of crypto on coordination and kind of using these tools to coordinate across time and space. And so when I'm kind of like thinking about these representational models that are common, I kind of like to think of it kind of like this, like visually, that we can see that crypto has each time kind of expanded the limits of its representational model, but this is kind of overlaid on top of the actual territory. But I think it's important to note that kind of like, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And so whatever kind of representational model we're kind of choosing to try to understand this thing is never going to likely cover all of the territory in crypto, right? But it's important to kind of be aware of that and to know that like we can't kind of like just simply create like the perfect metaphor or definition for all these things, because likely there are going to be ways that over time it's going to expand out of that representational model. And so it's kind of like something to critically think about when we're explaining these things to people, and like when we're also building applications on top of this, because the models that we choose to kind of think about and how we're building these things can affect how we build it and like what we prioritize for building. And so I think all of this is really important because in the kind of larger scheme of things, when we're talking about the internet, as much as I have grown up with the internet and I've loved it and it's brought me a lot of like wonderful things, I think we need to keep in mind that the internet is not forever and that it has changed quite a lot, and the way that we think about the internet changed quite a lot, from when it was first introduced in the 80s or 90s or whatever, up until now. The way that these different tech companies have kind of structured the internet for us makes people think that the internet is a particular way, or it is a particular thing. And this is like heavily influenced by the kind of common thing of creating a startup in Silicon Valley or wherever else, working in your garage, and then this kind of like mythical story of like a bunch of boys in the garage kind of creating then Google or whatever, and thinking of this as like the way also as well that we should do Web3 kind of organizations. And so what we've come to now at this point is sort of like, well, now we have a few big tech giants in which we are kind of like their peasants in their kind of like, their walled gardens in which we are or are not allowed to use their various features and platforms. And we're kind of like restricted by what those platforms are able to or able not to do. And so a lot of people kind of think like, oh, the internet is Facebook. The internet is, and which to a large extent is kind of true, right? Like I think like Facebook owns like a very large percentage of overall internet traffic. And so I think like it is this kind of like the way we think about these representational models then influence the way in which other people who use our products understand the internet. And so that needs to be made aware and try to kind of create, I think we're long overdue for very new ways to interact with the internet. And I think that's what a lot of people are interested in Web3 for, because they're trying to find like, a lot of people say like they want the internet to be fun again. They want to like re-experience like those things that they felt in the beginning of the internet, where now we've kind of had this consolidation of power and wealth, to where we just have like a few tech companies that basically rule it, most of it. And so I think as well, I just wanted to mention kind of how this relates, especially to technical infrastructure and social relationships, is that Oftentimes we kind of think of technical and social relationships as separate. But I would argue that you can never kind of cleanly separate, like when we're talking about technical infrastructure versus we're talking about like social relationships, like you cannot separate them. They are like intrinsically linked. No matter if you are a builder of a technical infrastructure, you are facilitating a particular social relationship uh, through that technical infrastructure, right? And the example that I like to give to kind of like explain this is the differences between a client server model versus a peer-to-peer model. These are just like kind of two broad, basic kind of ways people will build technical infrastructure. The client server model is just kind of like the usual big tech, like the owner of the server, which is usually Facebook, Twitter, or whoever else. Whatever the company is, they have all of the data in their repository, and you have the client in which you make requests through your application, the client, in order to like send a tweet, make a post, to read something, to like something. And you go through these like kind of very quick checks within their servers to make sure you didn't like, post something that was whatever that is against their legal policies or something. Whereas a peer-to-peer model is something where if you are a part of the network, at least, you are a participant in that network, and that data is shared across many different computers. And therefore, you are like asking each other for access for that data. And there is not necessarily a centralized entity that holds that. And I think this is, something to keep in mind is that this facilitates different social relationships and therefore different material outcomes. So if we take a look at the music industry and the sort of the first creation of like a peer-to-peer file sharing service, Napster and such. Napster basically caused a huge drop in music revenue for the music industry. You can argue or not whether that was a good thing or a bad thing, whatever else, but at least we can say that materially it caused something, right? It caused like a real material change in the music industry. And you kind of see this if you look at Napster, how it looked like, and then if you look at now today with things like Spotify, you can see that like capitalism has kind of responded to this need to like make sure that they're still able to make profits in the music industry. And they've done this through music streaming, in which they've now kind of cheapened basically the work of artists and musicians and such, which they get paid very, very little per stream. But this is kind of like the material thing that has material outcome of what has caused this kind of like shift to peer-to-peer networks, so the introduction of peer-to-peer networks for file sharing. And then additionally, when we're talking about specifically about social relationships, I like to kind of compare and contrast things like traditional corporations or tech startups, which really ultimately want to become traditional corporations. Oftentimes they want to become the new Googles or the new Facebooks or whatever else. Like if you look at how they're organized like a pyramid generally, right? At the top, you have the shareholders who own the company. And then like you have the stratification of people with like less and less power as you go down. And generally there's more of the people at the bottom. And they have like kind of like less of a say in what happens in the corporation. This is compared to something like a worker cooperative, in which you as a worker are also an owner in that endeavor, in that business, and you are able to kind of put your interests both as an owner and as a worker as like core to how the organization is run. And this causes like serious material effects. If we look at wage inequality in traditional companies versus cooperatives, there's a huge difference, right? Cooperatives, they generally have, to take the example, the biggest cooperative, Mondragon in Spain, they have a 6-to-1 or a 9-to-1 CEO to line worker ratio as far as their income, whereas the EU average is 129-to-1 and the US average is 339-to-1. So you can see that like the structure of the social organization has very serious material effects on the way in which people who are inside of this hierarchy are able to express their own power and able to kind of whether or not they have unequal or not wages. And then to kind of think about this through like the comparison of like Web 2 versus Web 3, we can see that like having a separation with your identity and the application is a very different social relationship to the application or the company that is running that application, right? You no longer have to create a profile specific to that platform, to that corporation, and instead you have much more say in how you handle those things. You have more kind of control over your funds and whatnot. You don't have to buy kind of like, basically Chuck E. Cheese tokens within different like platforms. You instead have kind of like more autonomy in how you're able to manage those things. It puts a little bit more onus on the individual in a lot of ways. But I think the kind of like the cool things that I think that's happening right now with account abstraction maybe help with kind of like some of those UX things. And so we see as well in the Web3 space that there is kind of like this proto-cooperative behavior where some different applications have done similar things to what cooperatives have already been doing for like hundreds of years. We see like Uniswap with their airdrop, which is like, I think one of the first airdrops to happen in the DeFi ecosystem. This is very similar to how consumer cooperatives work, where the more you kind of use the cooperative infrastructure, the more profit sharing you'll be given at the end of the year, for example. You see this with Safe, in which they've made it easy to create kind of joint bank accounts, kind of like a collective endeavor with like sharing real resources with your friends or with fellow organizers. And you see this in like kind of like more fun things with like PartyDAO, PartyBid, in which you can have like collective ownership of NFTs. But so if there's kind of like one thing, like a North Star for people in crypto that I think they should take away is to simply build collectively owned digital infrastructure. The current digital infrastructure in which we are kind of reliant on is one that is very centrally owned by simply a few actors who own a lot of capital, who own a lot of money, and therefore a lot of power over how we are able to interact with one another through this digital infrastructure, right? I think there's a reason why people aren't enjoying the internet as much as maybe they did before, because a lot of the technical infrastructure is facilitating particular social interactions that benefit the corporation to make more money off of your interactions on social media, to take one example. And so I think if as users, workers, however you want to see it, we're able to control or have some ownership over how these platforms are used and how they use our data and what kind of behaviors it wants to facilitate, or relationships it wants to facilitate, then I'm pretty sure most people would pick something different than what we have now. And so, yeah, I got a couple of nice quotes from different people for the book, including Vitalik, the founder of Ethereum, Nick Cernick, Primavera de Filippi, Nathan Schneider, and a few others, Bertaki, just to show off and name drop. And then in case you still unsure about the book, there was a review posted in CoinDesk called Crypto and the Real Meaning of Radicalism, which David Morris gave a review of the book if you want to read that. And yeah, and then this is a QR code that hopefully still works to a link tree with some places you can get the book if you haven't already. So there we go.
Excellent.
Do some Q&A.
Perfect. Yeah. So yeah, let's open up for some Q&A. Usually what we like to do too is have like a sort of like a roundtable discussion as well with the rest of the audience. So yeah, let's just kind of kick it off. So I guess I'll go ahead and ask the first question. So you mentioned previous representation models being leveraged in crypto currently, blockchain currently. So what sort of representation models do you think you would suggest? I know you kind of talked a bit about cooperatives and things like that. So I don't know, curious to see what you have to say about that.
Yeah. I mean, like I definitely still hold kind of like all models are wrong, some are useful. So it depends on kind of like the context that you are in that you think might be kind of like the most useful in that particular time. I definitely am a big fan of cooperatives, and I think that's kind of like as far as like low-hanging fruit or like a place in which you want to kind of learn a lot from, I think the cooperative space is one where you can learn a lot from. I think what is kind of like interesting to see over time is kind of a lot of people who started off in DAOs and trying to think of like, oh, now we can like, we don't have to be beholden to like these giant corporates. We can like create our own organizations, our own businesses, which are democratically run, da da da. They begin to describe things that are similar to a lot of cooperatives, and many of those people have come to cooperatives as a place to learn from, which I think is very interesting. I think it's kind of like this kind of like a realization of just like, oh, there was this already existing space that was kind of thinking about the same questions, but they simply weren't aware of it because it's not something that like, I don't think most business schools or like, you know, you don't learn it in school what a cooperative is. And, you know, that's another thing, you know, cultural hegemony. But yeah, I think that's like one model I think to look at. I think like I try to think of things in like a smaller way, like rather than trying to say like crypto is like a thing and like try to make these direct metaphors because I find them always very, very lacking and like not explaining very much and like oftentimes kind of obscuring more than it helps. I try to think of things as like, well, what it is that we want to do, what are some things that are out there that exist that maybe have similar outcomes. Maybe we can think about that and apply that to see how that may work in through this decentralized infrastructure in which there are different technical affordances. And so, of course, it's not going to map one to one, but I think like understanding where you can learn from that is really interesting. So, I mean, labor unions, of course, I think are really interesting places to look for inspiration. I think social wealth funds are really interesting. Community currencies and local currencies. There's like this whole plethora of different work by a lot of people since, I don't know, several decades on alternative currency type of stuff that I think is often overlooked. But yeah, there's a lot, and maybe another one to mention is kind of like I don't know, looking into like credit clearing and things like this. Some of these like the way credit clearing is a really interesting one to me because it's like banks already do credit clearing with each other, and that's how they like save on having not needing like the full amount of capital that you would need to make sure that each transaction at a bank happens like by itself. Like they just have all the transactions at once, like over the day, for example, and then they clear it there. So you'd have less of a need for capital. So I think like think about that model and like, but applying that at a much smaller scale or at the individual level or like the small business level, which has been done before, but I think crypto hasn't really looked into it too much. There's like a growing group of people who kind of use the meme collaborative finance to kind of explore this. But yeah, these are things that I've kind of like spoken about on the podcast before, but yeah.
Excuse me.
Excellent. Yeah, go
Can
ahead,
you
Bob.
hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay. So, hey, Joshua, I'm really happy that you have written this book and have written all this stuff, and I do definitely want to read the book. And so, I are you familiar with the term social provisioning?
I don't think so. You can explain it?
It means it means a socialist organization provisioning the requirements of life for all of its citizens. You know, provisioning food, housing, healthcare, whatever, energy, whatever else they need, and also we would hope now do it in such a way as to not kill the environment. Has anybody in the people who are talking about with crypto radicals thinking on that level?
Not like as far as using that term, I would say. But it is a good term that I think that kind of, yeah, succinctly kind of describes a lot of things that I think people would be interested in. I think there is generally, of course, like people kind of lean on kind of like market oriented thinking about provisioning. And that's something that I think now with kind of like this big bear market, I think I find that a lot of people are kind of questioning, are kind of like thinking that something needs to change if crypto is to kind of survive or become what it's like promised it would become. But yeah, I mean, I think that happens at like a very small level. I think whenever you are in a kind of multi-signature wallet or like a certain type of DAO in which there's high trust, like I think that ends up happening in a very small way. But I think it would be like I'm interested in, yeah, basically like trying to find more mechanisms for social provisioning rather than kind of like market-based provisioning. I assume that's kind of like what kind of like these are kind of like different things.
That gets me thinking on a distinction that I originally found in a book by Varoufakis, but it was like the difference in between market value and usage value, and talking about poetry that would have close to zero market value, but people can still have a deeply meaningful experience. Or with an example of like, if I ask you for a favor to help me, I don't know, move some boxes and it's really meaningful to me, etc., you might do it. But if I try to pay you for it, you'll be like, no, dude, I'm busy.
Yeah, sure. I'm definitely someone who I don't like my friends paying me if they ask me to help them with something. Like I would rather just hang out. If you ask me to move, like just give me some beers and let's hang out afterwards or something, than like trying to come up with the market rate is not how I think most people kind of interact with their friends. But yeah, I think the term usually, I think he's like getting at kind of like the kind of like, the traditional Marxist term of like use value versus exchange value. That when you have a commodity, you have a thing, like most of the time you can use it for something, so it has a use value to it, but you can also exchange it for something else. Like you can sell it on the market for some sort of exchange, and that oftentimes these two, use value and exchange value, aren't always like closely linked. That something can have a lot more use and it is like exchangeable, or much more exchangeable than it does have use. So I mean, I think definitely crypto world has this kind of fetishization of exchange value, of like, I'm getting something because I can then exchange it for something more, right? And I think, and this is just like the effects of capital, like capital as a relation in which you're like always trying to make a profit off of some other, some investment that you've made. So you're always focusing on exchange value. And this is not a problem just in crypto. This is a problem in like the larger economy, of course. And this kind of fetishization of exchange value has therefore kind of like, it means that people cannot use the thing that they want to use because they cannot exchange it. Like it's the prices become too high, or like, all these other issues. So yeah, I think there's this kind of like, I think Varoufakis is saying probably that we need to be focusing more on the use value of things and the exchange value of things. Yeah.
Which seems a super complicated problem when even participation or engagements, etc., like as we go into reputation systems and like the quantification of everything advances. But I wonder if there comes a tipping point where everything is so financialized that it's completely unescapable and you just kind of give up on trying to track it. But I don't know. I don't know if you're familiar with augmented bonding curves, but for me, a fascinating idea some time back, thinking is like, okay, yeah, it can be financialized, but you can still sort of stabilize it a little bit, like protect it from wild speculation, which like there was the whole idea that as cryptocurrencies, as this market grows, the swings are going to become less big, and that hasn't really happened. Like we're still seeing like 80-90% swings or more in so many currencies, etc., in so many protocols that it becomes unusable.
Yeah. No, I talk about augmented bonding curves in the second section. I'm good friends with Jeff Emmett, who's done a lot of work on that. But yeah, I think there's a fantasy a bit that markets are like become more efficient over time. That I think just like hasn't proved right in crypto so much, that the belief that like eventually the price will kind of stabilize at a certain point. But the thing is that crypto, right, the way it's designed at the moment, the way it's kind of like working is that a lot of people make a lot of money off of the volatility of these tokens and token prices. And so like there's no incentive if you are someone who's already made so much money and you have so many tokens and that you are, in crypto we call them whales. Like if you're a whale, you're able to manipulate markets like crazy. Like you can buy and sell just like several percentages of the entire like total market cap of a cryptocurrency, and therefore like that the price is going to drop, and therefore you can set up your bets in other places to make sure that you will profit in the end. But yeah, I think augmented bonding curves are interesting, and I wish they were used more. I think they're like an interesting thing for like public goods funding. It's kind of really an augmented bonding curve is kind of like a bonding curve in which you like pay a little bit of taxes on. It's kind of like a little decentralized community tax or something like that, but it helps fund the community itself, so that even if you are someone who, I don't know, you try to speculate on the token, that there is some amount of tax being paid. It's kind of like the answer to trying to fund communities and things that are not profitable directly, by having this like little tax, I guess. But yeah, lots of place or a lot of space to kind of like play around with that design.
So it looks like Bob has another question. Go ahead. Oh, you're muted, Bob.
Yes. Okay, so I figure out how to lower my hand. Okay, so no, it doesn't do that.
We can hear you now.
Somewhere there's anyway. So I have one more question. That's sort of like, have you considered alternative mechanisms for coordination? Because I like that you had that layers where the coordination is the highest level there. Have you considered other actual? So it's like blockchains are not actually peer-to-peer. There's this blockchain in the middle, and everybody has to go through the same blockchain or a digital representative of it. And so there are other actual peer-to-peer coordination protocols that are being experimented with, and it might be interesting to think about those too.
Yeah, I mean, like I would say that blockchains are peer-to-peer at the node level. Like if you have a node, then you are like part of the peer-to-peer network. But the way that most people interact with the blockchain is as a user, in which you are going through someone else's node in order to use the network. I have like issues with that a little bit in that, like most people who use peer-to-peer file sharing services don't run a node on that file sharing service. So then like there's like certain levels in which you can interact with the peer-to-peer system. And then so it's also a question of like how easy is it for an average person to take part in like that higher, the same level of hierarchy of the peer-to-peer nodes or servers. There is, of course, I did write a bit about Holochain in the book. Holochain takes like a different approach in which they're not a blockchain. They use a distributed hash table in which each user has their own chain, and they don't. So like by not having global consensus, instead only having local consensus amongst users of a different application, they're kind of like they're making it easier for the average user to be at the same level in the hierarchy as part of the peer-to-peer network. So yeah, so I mean, I wrote a little bit about it.
Very local consensus is also a lot faster. What is the decision time in most of the cryptocurrency blockchains that you're using now?
Yeah, I mean, like the block time, I think on Ethereum, I think it's like 15 seconds, something like that, I want to say. But yeah, generally they are quite slow. I think it's kind of it is about a bit as well. Like I'm still back and forth. I don't know. Like I just want to, like, Holochain is a really interesting technology, like theoretically and conceptually. But they're still not in production yet. They're not at like the level of like blockchain that already existing blockchains are at. So I'm like kind of waiting to see how it can handle like basically a real big production use case, because there are some people have doubts that their security model is safe enough for a production application that, like, whatever a blockchain does. So
we'll see. We're going to be trying it fairly soon, as soon as some of the glitches get worked out. There's another technology that's in work that Christine Weber is putting together in the Fediverse. I don't want to try to even give it a description right now, but she and other people are working on another thing that has some history behind it, that has some proof behind it.
Cool. Yeah.
So it looks like Artem has a question.
Yeah.
Hi guys. Joshua, thank you for the presentation. I just wanted to ask you, maybe it's a bit off topic, I'm not sure, but I think you worked with Primavera on the concept of coordinations, and I'm really like interested in that. I don't know much about it, to be honest. I know it's like an alternative to network states, and I'm just curious if you could talk about coordinations a little bit, and maybe, yeah, like, I don't know if it's relevant or not for this talk, but you can comment on that as well.
Sure. I mean, I can relate it a bit. So the kind of like whole endeavor that started with like creating coordinations started from basically us being frustrated with the network states and how Balaji was kind of presenting a lot of the problems that he presents in the book, and how like crypto or blockchains kind of like may influence that problem or change it or whatever else, and thinking that like he's not doing it justice and he's not going to do it justice. But he's going to have a lot of influence, and like people are going to be like, wow, that he's so smart, amazing, because maybe they like haven't dug as deeply into these like kinds of issues. And so we kind of like, ahead of he started his own network state podcast. We started the podcast to kind of like get ahead of him on our criticisms about the book, because we had quite a lot. But we didn't want it to be kind of purely a criticism. I think criticism is good, but like you can only go so far. If you go up to someone and you're like, and they're like a huge network state fan, and you're like, oh, network states are bad because XYZ, then they're going to be like, okay, what's your alternative? And so this is kind of like our attempt at like trying to then it kind of like pushed us to make this alternative to like rethink how these different things are affected by blockchain and crypto, the idea of sovereignty, the idea of like what the nation states is and is not able to do, or what a blockchain can like emulate or simulate as part of like a nation state, and but also questioning whether or not we should be thinking of this through a nation state. So like with Balaji's network state, I would compare what a network state is basically like a Silicon Valley tech venture capitalist way of like creating a business and then scaling it, but applying that in the model of state creation. So like he basically is essentially advocating for a kind of like combination of a state that is essentially privately owned in many ways, although he doesn't like say it explicitly. It's like implied throughout the book. And he kind of thinks of like communities of kinship, or people who have kinship with one another, as being a very like singular thing, as more like a consumer like brand obsession type of thing. So the examples of people who would want to join a network state include people who don't like the FDA, or people who eat keto, or like vegans, as like being a reason for why people would congregate, buy land, and then create their own state. So we found that like to be a little bit silly. And so our thing is that we want to be like also more true to kind of like the crypto ethos. Like our thinking is that like, weren't we supposed to be doing this stuff like without the state, like not like against the state or something, you know, like, so it's a bit strange to see this kind of like libertarian guy go into that. And so for us, like a coordination is like similarly, you know, finding people you have kinship with. So not necessarily people that you have the exact same interests and think you need to make a state around that, but that you have kind of a relationships with, in which you have solidarity for those people in that group. So you are willing to kind of make sure that other people in the group are taken care of. And then also kind of like use decentralized technologies to kind of like augment how people relate with one another and how these groups are able to coordinate across time and space. And so the idea is less about how do we create a new state for our utopia, and is more about thinking like, you know, we have people generally think of society or the economy or whatever else as separated into two sectors, right? You have the public sector on one side and a private sector on the other. And like, depending on your politics, you'll choose either one or the other. And one means you're more right and the other one means you're more left. And we're saying that like, actually, there is more than just these two sectors in society. There is this third sector, this what we call civil society, or like types of organizations that are not sort of meant to be pursuing profit, so not like a corporation, and also not within the logic of a state. And so like there are plenty of these types of organizations, labor unions counts of those, churches, cooperatives, like community gardens, like all these types of things. And our idea is that we need to kind of, or the commons, yes. And the idea is that we want to kind of like, since we've had these like 50 years of neoliberalism in which like this sector has increasingly or has decreased in size over time, as people have to like spend more time going to work and they have less time to like do other things, this has gotten smaller. And so we want to kind of like reinforce this sector of society. We think this is kind of like the place where crypto can really shine. And this means basically having these like, you thinking of crypto as also like a scaffolding for the creation of institutions that people then can kind of like use as part of their own infrastructure, rather than having to rely on a corporation or a state for everything. So that's kind of like, I have like 10 hours at least of podcasts talking about this idea. But there's also like some writing on Medium that a couple of people in blockchain have done as well, that maybe I can share if you're interested. I can find it.
Yeah, I guess I had one final question. So something that you mentioned as critiquing network states is like, you know, the opt-out approach. So I know you mentioned, augmented bonding curves and stuff like, like the idea like burning or like rage quitting. So are these what's called cooperatives? I'm sorry, coordinations. Maybe you could talk about where you see like kind of the balance of like an opt-out approach and kind of like a community stewardship approach. I'm just kind of curious because I know that was kind of something that initially interested me of like critiquing the that opt-out of society approach.
You mean like kind of like because like Balaji is he's really into exit, the idea of exit as being kind of like the ultimate
Yeah,
right.
yeah, exactly. But you also mentioned like augmented bonding curves, and I know an aspect of like a bonding curve is you burn and you leave, you could leave, you take your position, leave an organization. It's kind of parallel to things in other like DAO space like rage quitting and things like that. So I'm just kind of curious to see how you kind of balance those two things.
Mm. I
That's
mean, I
if
would
that
say
makes
that
sense.
yeah. I mean, I'd say that like in an augmented bonding curve, it's kind of you're not exiting with everything that you came in with necessarily because you have to pay this tax. And then that's meant to be as a way to keep people in the group. But I would say that, you know, if it is very easy for you to leave a group or to leave a community and there is no repercussions for doing so for you or anybody else, that means that the group that you're in was not a community in the first place, right? It should be difficult to leave a community, as in it should be that you are like interdependent with other people in this group. That's how you know you're part of a community. This doesn't mean that like that you should stay inside of the cult if like you're not enjoying the organization or the group, but that like that there are sacrifices that have to be recognized if you are entering or leaving a group. So like this idea is a bit of a fantasy that like you can like exit anything you want at any time and there will be no repercussions, because that's like simply not how the world works. And so like I think for us it's like there's of course like there should be the option to exit, there should be the choice to exit, of course, but it's probably likely that you're not going to exit something if you have a lot of voice in it. If you feel that your rights are being recognized and that your opinion is being heard, then you will probably not exit and you will instead choose to take part in the organization, even if it's not perfect and up to everything that you want it to be, because like there's no such thing as the perfect organization that's going to like solve everyone's problems and everyone's needs. These are like very complex problems, and all you can do rather than trying to like give a simple solution is to instead kind of manage the contradictions that are inside of group dynamics inherently. And so like for us, it's more that like it's complete idealism to think that you can exit freely at any moment a group or organization and like there not be any consequences, and that we're just kind of like looking at things as how the world is, I would say. And so like this, I mean, I think you mentioned community stewardship. I mean, I think that's just kind of getting at this idea of like how do you have a voice within these types of groups and organizations, and how are you able to express that voice in a way that you feel is appropriate?
Gotcha. Okay. Very, very interesting conversation, guys. It seems like we are out of time, actually over time. But yeah, once again, really appreciate your time, Joshua.